I spent years writing my first novel the wrong way. Not because the story was bad, not because the characters were bad, but because I was building a house without a blueprint. Some writers spend months outlining every chapter before they write the first sentence. Others sit down with nothing but a character and an interesting premise, then discover the story one page at a time. Both approaches have produced best-selling novels. Both approaches have passionate defenders. And after writing 2 crime thrillers myself, I've actually used both writing methods. For my first novel, I wrote almost entirely from the bottom up. For my second novel, I completely changed my process and built the story from the top down. After experiencing both methods firsthand, I discovered that one approach allowed me to use my creativity much more effectively. I'm Jake Winters, and today I'm going to talk about top-down versus bottom-up storytelling. When people talk about outlining versus pantsing, which is writing by the seat of your pants, they're really talking about 2 different ways of building a story. Top-down writing starts with the big picture. Before worrying about dialogue, individual scenes, or chapter endings, you figure out the overall structure of the story before you begin writing. You identify your beginning, your ending, your major turning points, your character arcs, and how everything connects together. Once that framework exists, you begin filling in the details. Bottom-up writing works in the exact opposite direction. Instead of beginning with the blueprint, you begin with fragments. Maybe it's a fascinating character. Maybe it's a conversation you can hear in your head. Maybe it's a theme or a concept that you want to convey. You start sketching out those pieces and gradually discover what the larger story wants to become. Most writers actually fall somewhere between those 2 extremes. When I first started writing my first novel, My Obsession, I had almost no outline. I knew who my main character was, I knew roughly where I wanted him to end up. I had a few major scenes I was excited to write, but everything else I figured out as I went. Some days I'd write an entire chapter because I thought it would be interesting, then I'd have to spend the next several chapters figuring out how it actually fit into the story. Rather than writing sequentially, I'd write in a scattershot way, then rearrange the chapters in an order that made logical sense. Like fitting pieces of a puzzle together after you connected a few individual pieces. Characters evolved unexpectedly, relationships changed. Plot twists appeared halfway through the book because they suddenly seemed more interesting than my original idea. There was actually something incredibly exciting about writing that way. Every writing session felt like opening a mystery novel that no one, including me, had read before. Sometimes I'd surprise myself. Sometimes I'd discover connections I never planned. Those moments were genuinely magical. But there was a cost. Looking back, I realized that I was spending way too much energy discovering the story as I went, which meant I had less creative energy to make the characters and emotional payoffs engaging. With a bottom-up approach, the further you get into a novel, the more difficult it becomes to keep everything consistent. The more moving pieces you introduce, the harder it becomes to maintain story coherence. Every new chapter creates new constraints. Every plot twist affects everything that came before it. Every character decision changes what can logically happen later. Eventually, using a bottom-up approach, I found myself constantly going back to earlier chapters to fix things I'd accidentally broken. I'd introduced an interesting idea in chapter 18, only to realize it contradicted something I'd written in chapter 4. I'd come up with a better ending, which meant rewriting half the middle of the book. Bottom-up writing allows for incredible creativity, but it can also lead to enormous amounts of rewriting, especially for newer writers. And especially in thrillers. Mysteries do not forgive inconsistency. If the clues don't line up, if the timeline doesn't make sense, if a character suddenly knows something they couldn't possibly know, readers notice and the story suffers. Now, when I first started writing my second novel, I wanted to try something completely different. Instead of immediately writing chapter 1, I outlined the entire story. I figured out the ending before I figured out the beginning. I decided what every major reveal would be. I knew where each character would end up emotionally before I wrote their first line of dialogue. Then I began to fill in the details and flesh out the characters. Every chapter had a purpose. Every scene existed because it moved the larger story toward the destination I'd already chosen. Instead of wondering where the novel was going, I was solving the puzzle of how to get there. And as someone who writes thrillers, that change was huge. And honestly, I found it much more enjoyable. For the first time, I wasn't just trying to figure out what happened. I was building something with intention. When I first sketched my outline for His Prey, my second novel, it was only a few paragraphs long. I wrote a brief summary of what I wanted to see happen in the story, and then I divided the summary into 3 acts. Next, I began chopping each act into individual chapter summaries. A single sentence in Act 2 would go on to become an entire chapter. Eventually, my outline became the skeleton of the novel. It wasn't the final version, and things still changed while I wrote, but I had a clear blueprint for the entire story. I knew who each character was, what their purpose in the story would be, and the plan for how they would grow and develop as people as the story progressed. Sometimes people worry that outlining a story kills creativity. For me, it actually did the opposite. Because I wasn't constantly trying to figure out what happened next, I could spend my creative energy on making each scene stronger. The outline handled the destination. I could focus on the journey. Dialogue became better, characters became deeper, foreshadowing became intentional instead of accidental. I could plant clues dozens of pages before they paid off because I already knew exactly where the story was headed. As a thriller writer, that's an enormous advantage. Readers love those moments when they realize the answer was sitting right in front of them the entire time. Those moments are much easier to create when you've already seen the entire roadmap. One of the clearest examples of why I think planning matters isn't actually a novel. It's Disney's Star Wars sequel trilogy. Now, regardless of whether you personally enjoy those movies, there was a recurring criticism that kept coming up over and over again. And that is that the trilogy feels like each movie was pulling the story in a different direction. Major mysteries are introduced and then abandoned. Character arcs shifted dramatically between films. Themes established in one movie were reversed in the next. By the end, many viewers felt the trilogy lacked a cohesive vision from beginning to end. It's hard not to wonder how different those films might have felt if the entire trilogy had been mapped out before a single frame of Episode 7 was filmed. Imagine if the writers had already known exactly who Rey was from the beginning, exactly how Kylo Ren's story would end, exactly where every major mystery would lead. Imagine if they had known from the beginning whether Snoke was important or just a placeholder villain. And don't even get me started on bringing back the Emperor in Episode 9. To me, that felt less like the natural conclusion of the story and more like a last-minute attempt to solve a problem that the trilogy had created. Instead of each movie feeling like it was reacting to the previous one, the trilogy could have been building toward a single destination from the very beginning. Now, I don't know what happened in the writer's room. I wasn't there. But as a viewer, the trilogy feels like it was being built one movie at a time rather than as one complete story. And to me, that's the danger of approaching a massive story without a clear, overarching plan. Don't get me wrong, bottom-up stories can be incredibly effective. Some of the greatest writers in history have used that approach. But it's much harder to execute successfully, especially when you're dealing with a massive, interconnected story spanning multiple movies or novels. The Star Wars sequels are a good example of why having a clear blueprint can matter so much in long-form storytelling. In the final analysis, I'm not arguing that bottom-up writing is wrong. Far from it. Some of the greatest writers in history discover their stories as they write them. Stephen King is well known as a master of bottom-up storytelling. He often starts with an idea, a character, or a situation, then discovers where the story leads. The Stand is a great example. King started with a simple idea. What happens when a deadly virus wipes out most of humanity? From that seed, he built an entire world of characters, conflicts, and themes. The result is one of the most beloved novels ever written. Great stories can be told using this approach, but it requires a strong understanding of character, theme, and narrative instinct. If that's your process, don't let anyone convince you that you're doing it incorrectly. Writing is not engineering. There isn't one correct formula. But after writing 2 novels using both top-down and bottom-up approaches, I've discovered which process works best for me. I like knowing where I'm going before I start driving. Especially when I'm writing thrillers where every clue, every twist, and every revelation has to fit together like pieces of a puzzle. For me, building the blueprint first doesn't limit creativity. It gives creativity a foundation. And that foundation made writing my second novel a far smoother and far more enjoyable experience than writing my first. If you enjoy psychological thrillers, storytelling, or you're interested in learning about writing, I'd love to have you subscribe. I post new videos every week about writing, publishing, and the psychology behind great thrillers. And let's try something fun in the comments. What's an example of a story that you believe used either a top-down or a bottom-up approach? And tell me why you think it did or did not work. I'd love to see what you come up with. I'm Jake Winters, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.